You've heard of Rome. You've heard of the councils, the emperors, the great cathedrals. You've probably been told, directly or indirectly, that Christianity, as a structured belief system, was built inside the Roman Empire. But here's something that almost never makes the headline. By the time Rome started making official decisions about Christianity, someone in Africa had already been teaching it, explaining it, and shaping how people thought about it for decades. And most people have never heard his name. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Africa and Christianity? That combination surprises a lot of people, because the story we usually get starts in Jerusalem, moves through Greece, and lands in Rome. Africa doesn't always make the highlight reel, but that version of the story has a gap in it, a big one, because there was a city in North Africa, one of the most intellectually powerful cities in the entire ancient world, where Christianity was being studied, debated, and taught at a level that Rome hadn't caught up to yet. And in that city, there was a teacher, not a king, not an emperor, not a military general, just a teacher. But the ideas that came out of his classroom traveled across continents, influenced people who influenced councils, and shaped the way Scripture has been interpreted for nearly 2,000 years. His name was Origen of Alexandria. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Is it possible that a single teacher in a single city could shape an entire religion before that religion even had a central authority? Think about that for a moment, because if the answer is yes, then the story of Christianity doesn't start where most people think it does, and that changes everything. If you've never heard this story before, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to see one of the most well-known belief systems in human history from a completely different angle. To understand Origen, you first have to understand where he came from, because Alexandria wasn't just a city, it was an idea. Located on the northern coast of Egypt, Alexandria was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. At its peak, historians estimate it had somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 residents. That made it comparable to Rome itself in terms of population. But size wasn't what made Alexandria remarkable. It was what happened inside the city. Alexandria was the home of the Great Library, one of the most ambitious knowledge projects in all of human history. Scholars came from across the Mediterranean world to study there: mathematicians, philosophers, physicians, astronomers, the kind of people who didn't just accept what they were told, they asked why. And that culture of questioning, that deep intellectual energy, it seeped into everything. Alexandria wasn't a homogeneous city, it was layered, complex. You had Greek-speaking scholars who had absorbed centuries of Platonic and Stoic philosophy. You had a significant Jewish population with their own rich tradition of scriptural interpretation, people who had spent generations thinking carefully about what sacred texts meant and how they should be read. You had Egyptians carrying the weight of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. And increasingly, you had Christians, people following a relatively new movement that was still figuring out what it believed. These groups didn't always agree. In fact, they frequently didn't agree. But they talked to each other, they argued, they debated, they challenged each other's assumptions. And that friction, that constant intellectual collision, produced something remarkable. It produced sharper thinking. Here's a question worth sitting with. Do you think a new belief system grows stronger when it's protected from challenge or when it's forced to defend itself, explain itself, and compete with other powerful ideas? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think. Because Alexandria was the second kind of environment. Christianity didn't get to sit comfortably there. It had to make arguments. It had to engage with Greek philosophy. It had to respond to Jewish scholarly tradition. It had to hold its own in a city where everyone had read a lot and nobody was easily impressed. And that pressure, that competitive intellectual environment, produced some of the sharpest Christian thinkers in history, including one young man who grew up watching all of this. And in the middle of this city, with all its noise, all its arguments, all its competing ideas, one teacher began to stand out. Origen was born around 184 or 185 CE in Alexandria. He grew up in a Christian household. His father, Leonides, was a scholar, a man who took learning seriously and raised his son with the same commitment to study. By the time Origen was a child, he was already being immersed in scripture, in Greek literature, in the kind of broad intellectual education that Alexandria made possible. By most historical accounts, Origen was considered remarkable from an early age. His father reportedly would place his hand on the sleeping child's chest and give thanks, believing, according to later accounts, that something significant lived inside this boy. But life in Alexandria during that period was not safe for Christians. In the early 3rd century, Christians in the Roman Empire lived under real threat of persecution. Believing openly could cost you your reputation, your freedom, and sometimes your life. When Origen was still a teenager, around 202 CE, his father Leonides was arrested under an imperial decree targeting Christians. Leonides was executed. Let that sit for a moment. Origen was a teenager, and he watched the state execute his father for his beliefs. There are historical accounts suggesting that Origen wanted to surrender himself as well, to face the same fate. His mother, the story goes, hid his clothes to prevent him from leaving the house. He didn't just study Christianity, he lived through a time when believing could cost you everything. And here's something worth asking yourself. When a person grows up under that kind of pressure, watching persecution, losing family, does it shake their faith, or does it harden it into something unbreakable? For Origen, it seems to have done the second. After his father's death, Origen took over the responsibility of supporting his family. He became a teacher. Still young, still in his teens by some accounts, he began instructing students in Alexandria. And those students weren't just Christians. He taught anyone who was curious, pagans, skeptics, people from across the philosophical and religious spectrum of Alexandria. He was building something, not just an income, not just a reputation. He was building a way of thinking. And that need to explain, to teach, to make ideas clear and accessible and defensible would shape everything that came after. Here is where things get genuinely interesting. Most teachers of Origen's time taught scripture by reading it and explaining what it said. Straightforward, literal. This is what the text says, this is what it means. Origen did something different. He approached scripture as a layered document, a text that operated on multiple levels at once. He believed there was a surface meaning, what the words literally said, but beneath that, he believed there was a deeper moral meaning, and beneath that, an even deeper spiritual or allegorical meaning. In other words, not everything in Scripture was meant to be taken at face value. Now, before you react to that, consider this. This idea didn't come from nowhere. The Jewish philosophical tradition in Alexandria, particularly the work of a scholar named Philo of Alexandria, had already been doing something similar with Hebrew Scripture. Reading texts allegorically, finding layers of meaning beneath the literal words. Origen absorbed that tradition, and he applied it to the Christian scriptures. He also produced one of the most remarkable scholarly projects of the ancient world, a work called the Hexapla, which placed 6 different versions of the Old Testament side by side in parallel columns, allowing readers to compare translations and identify differences. At a time when most people had access to one version of a text, Origen was doing something that looked almost like modern textual criticism. His written output was, by ancient standards, extraordinary. But here's the question his approach raised, and it's a question people are still arguing about today. If Scripture can be interpreted on multiple levels, who decides which interpretation is correct? If a text has a literal meaning and an allegorical meaning, and they seem to conflict, which one takes priority? And if a teacher says the surface reading isn't the real meaning, how do you verify that? How do you know they're not just finding the meaning they wanted to find? These are not simple questions, and Origen's willingness to raise them and to answer them made him compelling to some and deeply controversial to others. His classroom in Alexandria drew students from across the Mediterranean. People traveled specifically to learn from him. And the ideas he taught, this layered, philosophical, deeply reasoned approach to Scripture, those ideas traveled with his students when they left. And this way of thinking didn't stay in Alexandria. It began to spread. One of the most important things about Origen's influence is how indirect it often was. He didn't build an empire. He didn't hold political office. He wasn't connected to any central authority that could enforce his ideas. He was a teacher, and teachers shape people, and people carry ideas wherever they go. His students fanned out across the ancient world. Some became bishops, some became teachers themselves, some went to places like Caesarea in what is now modern Israel, where Origen himself eventually relocated and continued teaching. Some went further, and the ideas traveled with them. The allegorical method of reading Scripture, this idea that texts have deeper meanings beneath their surface, became enormously influential in Christian intellectual tradition. Later thinkers who shaped what we think of as classical Christian theology, figures like Ambrose, who became Bishop of Milan, and Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history, both engaged deeply with this tradition of interpretation. A tradition that runs, in important ways, back through Alexandria, back through the school Origen helped build. Long before official doctrines were decided at councils, before groups of bishops gathered to vote on what Christians should believe, ideas were already circulating, already being taught, already shaping how ordinary Christians understood their faith. And who shaped those ideas in their formative stage? Not councils, not emperors, teachers, writers, people who sat down and thought hard about what these texts meant and wrote their conclusions down. This raises a fascinating question about how ideas actually spread. Who really shapes a belief system? The people who make official decisions later, or the people who did the thinking first? If an idea is already widely circulating before any official body rules on it, does that ruling create the idea, or just confirm it? These aren't rhetorical questions. Historians of religion genuinely debate them, and Origen's story sits right in the middle of that debate, because his ideas were circulating widely before Rome had any centralized control over what Christians believed. And that brings us to a bigger question.
Let's talk about timing, because timing matters enormously here. Origen was active as a teacher primarily in the late 2nd and early 3rd century. He died around 253 or 254 CE, likely from injuries suffered during a period of persecution under the Emperor Decius. The Council of Nicaea, the first major church council where Christian leaders gathered to formally define core doctrines, didn't happen until 325 CE. That's more than 70 years after Origen's death. Origen was teaching, writing, and shaping Christian thought in a period before any of that, before there was a formal creed that all Christians were expected to affirm, before the Roman Empire had officially adopted Christianity, before there was a centralized institutional structure making binding decisions about what Christians should believe. He was teaching at a time when Christianity had no single center of control. Think about what that means. There was no headquarters, no single bishop whose word was final on every question, no universal agreement on exactly which books counted as authoritative scripture, no single agreed-upon method for interpreting those books. There were communities, there were teachers, there were local traditions, and there were ideas, circulating, competing, influencing each other across the Mediterranean world. Christianity in Origen's time was, in some ways, more like a diverse conversation than a single institution, and that conversation was happening in a lot of places at once, in Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Rome, and yes, powerfully, intellectually, in Alexandria. Here's a question I'll put directly to you. Does a religion grow stronger when it has one central authority defining what everyone believes? Or does it develop more richly when there are many centers of thought contributing to it at the same time? There's no simple answer to that. Different people will give very different responses based on what they value, but it's worth thinking about.
Because once Rome stepped in, once Christianity became officially connected to imperial power, things began to change. The diversity that had existed began to narrow. Official positions were defined. Some ideas that had been widely discussed were ruled out of bounds, and some of the people who had shaped the earlier conversation began to be viewed differently in retrospect, including Origen. Here is one of the more complicated parts of this story. Origen's influence was enormous during his lifetime and for several generations after his death. His students revered him. His commentaries were read widely. His methods shaped how Scripture was taught and interpreted across the Christian world. But centuries after his death, more than 250 years after, in 553 CE, a council declared certain teachings associated with his name to be officially unacceptable. It's important to be precise here. Scholars debate what Origen actually taught versus what later movements, groups who claimed to follow his ideas, actually developed. By the time of the condemnation, centuries had passed, and his writings had been interpreted, reinterpreted, and sometimes distorted. But the official stamp of controversy attached to his name did something significant. It didn't erase him. You can't fully erase someone who shaped so much of the tradition that came after him, but it made people quieter about acknowledging the connection. History doesn't always erase people completely. Sometimes it just makes them quieter. His influence is still visible if you know where to look, in the methods of biblical interpretation that became standard in Christian scholarship, in the theological questions he raised that later thinkers, Augustine, Aquinas, and others, continued to wrestle with, in the very shape of how educated Christians learned to read their scripture. But when people talk about the great shapers of Christian thought, his name doesn't come up as often as it should, and that raises a question worth thinking about. Do we remember the people who had the most influence, or the people whose influence was most officially approved? How many other figures in history, teachers, thinkers, writers, shaped important movements but got left out of the story that later got told? I'd genuinely like to know if you can think of other examples like this. Drop them in the comments, because Origen is probably not the only one. But influence doesn't disappear, even if the name does. Here's the bigger picture. The story of Christianity is often told as a story with a clear center of gravity. Jerusalem, Rome, a line of authority moving from one institution to the next. But the historical record is more complicated than that. Christianity spread across a diverse ancient world simultaneously. It developed in different environments, in contact with different intellectual traditions, shaped by different kinds of thinkers. Alexandria was one of those environments, and it was a particularly powerful one. It wasn't built in one place. It was shaped across different regions at the same time. Origen of Alexandria is one piece of evidence for that. A teacher in an African city, working before Rome had any centralized control over the religion, producing ideas that would travel across continents and influence the tradition for centuries. That doesn't diminish Rome's role. Rome's eventual influence on Christianity was real and significant, but it does complicate the story. It adds texture. It reminds us that when we look for the origins of big ideas, the origins are usually more distributed, more multicultural, more geographically spread out than any single simple story suggests. When you think about the history of a major religion, a major political system, a major cultural movement, do you tend to picture it coming from one place, one center? What if that's almost always a simplification? What if the actual origin story is almost always more complicated, more spread across different places and people than the version that gets repeated most often? I think that's almost always true, and I think the story of Origen is one clear example of it. And maybe that's the part most people never stop to question. Let's come back to where we started. Before Rome defined Christianity, there was already a teacher in Africa shaping how people understood it. Origen of Alexandria. Not a king, not a military conqueror, not a political figure with armies behind him. A teacher, a writer, a person who asked difficult questions and wrote down his best attempts at answers. And those answers, those methods, those ways of reading and thinking and engaging with ideas, they traveled far beyond his classroom. They shaped people who shaped councils. They influenced thinkers who became the foundations of Christian intellectual tradition. They left marks that are still visible today, even when his name isn't attached to them. He lived in a city that was one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. He operated in a period before the religion he studied had any single center of power, and he produced a body of thought that was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. So what do you think? Was Origen of Alexandria just one voice among many in a noisy, complicated moment in history? Or was he one of the voices that shaped everything that came after, even if the credit went elsewhere? Do you believe Christianity was shaped primarily inside Rome, or do you think the evidence points to multiple origins, multiple centers, multiple kinds of people contributing to something much bigger than any one city or institution? And here's the one that I keep thinking about. If teachers like Origen had never existed, if that intellectual tradition in Alexandria had never developed, would the ideas that define the religion today look different? I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but I think it's worth asking. Let me know what you think in the comments, because sometimes the biggest parts of history are the ones we almost overlook. And if this kind of story interests you, the hidden figures, the overlooked cities, the people who shaped the world without always getting credit for it, then you'll want to stick around. There are more stories like this one, and most of them start in places you wouldn't expect.